Hello and welcome everyone. You want to give a surprise to your opponent on the very second move of the game? So this video is just for you. We are going to have a look at the Vienna Gambit. We play a pawn to e4, e5 and now after this a common move for white to play if they want to go for the e4 opening is they play the bishop's opening by going with the bishop to c4, or they can also go for the Italian playing the knight to f3. But if you want to surprise your opponent, you can go for the Vienna game. You can play your knight to c3. Now here, after knight c3, if the opponent plays his knight to f6, you go for the immediate Vienna Gambit. This video is all about the Vienna Gambit. We are going to see all the lines what black can do after the move pawn to f4. If he accepts the gambit by capturing on the f4 square, he takes on f4. Then you push your pawn up on e5, attack the knight. If the knight goes back, that is where he has to go. Then you play knight f3. The idea behind knight f3 is to stop this queen h4 check. This is the main line in the Vienna gambit, accepted variation, right? So you play knight to f3, defending the h4 square so that the queen doesn't come in to give you a check. If he plays his pawn to d6, obviously he is annoyed by the pawn on e5. This pawn is stopping the knight to go on the f6 square. So he would want to exchange it. If he does that, then you go with the pawn to d4. If he captures over here, then you have an interesting move here. Play your queen to e2. The idea behind queen e2 is pinning the pawn to the king, right? If he places bishop to b4 on this move, then you first capture on the f4 square with your bishop. And on the next move, when he places queen to e7, maybe you can just capture here with the bishop, and you are doing much better as white there. Right? So you have the complete control in the center. Look at the pieces. They are amazingly developed and placed. While black will always have to struggle with the development of the pieces. So this is the main line in the Vienna game. What if he captures on the e4 square there, right? What if he's not capturing on e4, instead he places knight to c6? Well, that doesn't help him too, because if he places knight to c6, then you first capture on the e5 square, attacking the knight. He is gonna recapture it on the e5 with knight takes, and then you can give an attack, launch an attack towards his knight in the center by playing your pawn to d4. The knight goes back on the g6 square and you push another pawn. You attack the knight which is on f6 by playing your pawn to e5. If he goes back, now look at your pawns. Those are like the monstrous pawns, right? If he now you can play on knight to f3. Here, if he plays his pawn to d6, trying to attack in the center, then you first play a bishop to c4. What's the idea behind bishop c4 over here is after he captures, you can first go and castle. Given away the pawn, but okay, you are trying to win the queen there by a discovered attack. So let's say he captures on d4. Don't worry about it. Just go with your knight to g5. What is your aim? You're targeting on the f7 square. Here, if the opponent gets greedy and he captures the free knight on the c3 square with the pawn, then you can go with bishop f7, give a check. He comes up, then you can anytime go and recapture the queen, but first you go with your rook to e1 and it is going to be checkmate soon. As white, you can give a checkmate to the black king soon in the game after this. Correct? There are not much options where he can go basically. So that is not generally how the opponent would play, but if that happens, knight c6 is a wrong move. So, what else can he do? After the pawn f4, we have seen what happens if he accepts the gambit. We have seen what happens after he places knight to c6. Now, let's have a look what if he places pawn to d6. If he places pawn to d6 here in this position, that is also not that great. You go with the knight to f3 square, knight c6, normal developing move. Remember, whenever he places knight to c6, you have to pin his knight with your bishop. So you play a bishop to b5, pinning the knight to the king so that he can't move ever. If he unpins it, now you go with your pawn to d3. You don't want to block your bishop on f1 square first by playing your pawn to d3. You don't want to block it under your own pawn chain. So first develop it and then you play your pawn to d3. Okay, so this is a good overall good position. Here, black and white would are doing fine. They can continue the line. D6 is actually a good move if he does. But the best defense here from black is to play the pawn to d5. If your opponent plays this, that means he knows the theory. So what you have to do is you have to first capture on e5 square, attack the knight. If he captures on e4 with the knight, then there are two main lines over here. One is to play the pawn to d3 and attack the knight. The other is to play a knight to f3 and just ignore the threat that is going to attack you on the c3 square. Another common move here is to play the queen to f3. We are going to have a look at all these variations, but knight f3. After knight f3, black has a millions of options. He can just play his knight to c6, capture on the c3 square. He can play his bishop to e7. He can try to pin your knight. So there are millions of ways how black can respond to this. So we'll have a look at this later. What happens when you play a pawn to d3? If you play a pawn to d3, then he captures on the c3 square, and you can play you have to capture it back with b takes on c3. Your pawns are double, but that's fine because now you have an open file. The rook can go to the b file, and that's it. But what if here he goes with queen to h4? Like, let's say instead of capturing on the c3 square, what if after pawn d3 he places queen to h4? If he does that, then g6. That you shouldn't be bothered about this queen h4 move, because now if even if he captures on the g3 square with his knight, thinking that he's gonna give you a discovered check and attack your rook, you have to play on knight to f3, attacking the queen. The queen has to stay in the h file so that he doesn't lose the knight. Let's say he goes to the h5 square, then you have amazing move here. You play a knight to d5. What's the idea behind knight d5 is you are attacking on the c7 square with your knight, giving a check and trying to win the rook. If he captures your rook over here, then his rook is hanging. But if he doesn't do that, let's say he defends it by going with his knight to a6, then you have this sneaky little move, knight to f4, attacking the queen. Where's the queen supposed to go? Has to stay in the h file, right? Remember, otherwise the knight on the g3 square will be lost. So he'll have to go with the queen to h6. Let's say he goes with the queen to h6 square. Now you play your knight to e2. Interesting, isn't it? I mean, you can just capture the queen, attacking the discovered attack on the queen, and you can capture the knight there. All right. So this was the line what happens when you play a pawn to d3. But what I recommend in this video is you play your queen to f3. Now queen f3 is a beneficial move. You're giving an attack to the knight, you're bringing your queen out, you're aiming at the f7 square later in future. So here he has multiple choices. Let's say he starts with knight takes on the c3 square. If he does that, then you should remember that you have to capture it back with the b pawn and not with the d pawn. The idea is if you capture with the d pawn, then you're not cementing your center. You cannot cement the center. The pawn on the e file will be isolated. You can definitely try that. Then you have to develop your bishop. Maybe you can castle on the long side. So if you want to capture d takes over here, then he does anything. You have to develop the bishop and you can aim for a long side castle. But what better option over here is you capture on c3 square with b takes on c3. So if he here places bishop to e7, then you can immediately go with your bishop pawn to d4, cement the center, control the center. After he castles, you can play your bishop to d3. Idea is simple: develop the knight on the e2 square and castle on the next move. Correct? Even if he gives an attack to your d pawn, that doesn't matter because you're already defending it quite well. Correct? All right. But what happens after immediately after this, after bishop to e7, what if he directly goes with his pawn to c5? If here he places pawn to c5 square, then also you go bishop d3. Don't worry that the bishop will get trapped after pawn c4 because your bishop still has a move. The bishop can go to f5 square and then you can exchange. White is doing well here. Not that great, but well. All right. So what after directly this, he doesn't go bishop e7. Directly he pushes his pawn to c5 so that he is stopping you from going to d4. That doesn't stop us. We are still going to play the pawn to d4 square. He captures on the d4 square. You capture it back and then you can push your pawn to c3. This is a little risky because then who's going to protect your pawn on c3 square? Will always have to have one of the piece defending the c3 square and the pawn chain will be weakened. Instead, going for d4 immediately, you have a better choice. What you can do is go with your queen to g3. So idea here with queen g3 is you are attacking on g7 square. Later, you can just play a pawn to d4. Whenever he castles, this can be a threat. This is the basic idea there. If he defends it by playing his pawn to g6 over there, then you can go with the knight to f3. Okay, bishop f5, and now you play. You can exchange the bishop. Doesn't not a problem if he capture. We are not mainly worried about the doubled pawns. We are aiming for a short castle. We are aiming for a short castle there. The rook will file will be open. And overall, white will have a good position to play. Alright, so this was when we play our queen to f3, and he is capturing on the c3 square. Okay, there are two more lines what he can do. What about he goes with his knight to c6, keeping the knight on the d4 square and not capturing on the c3 square. Then you first pin the knight. So this is little tricky that you have to remember it every time. What to do when what he plays. For example, if he plays his knight to c6, remember that you have to play a bishop to b5 and pin this knight to the king. If he captures on the knight takes on the c3 square, then remember you have to capture with the b pawn. If over here he captures your knight on the c3 square with his knight on e4, then there's a slight difference. Here you don't capture with the b pawn, instead you go with the d pawn. Now the difference is you have already developed the bishop out, right? So few little variations here and there you have to try. This is the best line that black can do. He can go with his queen to h4. A basic setup here he wants. After you give an attack to that queen, he'll go with his queen to e4. And to compensate the position, he'll just exchange the queens. Both the sides will have equal development and equal material. So this is what black can do there. But you have this little move that you can play a bishop to e3, sacrifice a pawn. If he captures your pawn on the c2 square with the queen, then you sacrifice another pawn. You sacrifice on the b2 square, you just play on knight to e2. What is the idea? We are going to give away all the pieces on the queen side. We are simply going to castle. What are we aiming? We are aiming at the king side here. We are aiming at the f7 square. If he captures a bishop on the b5 square, we have given away 2 pawns and a bishop so far. So we have 5 points down. But this will result into a checkmate for black because you can capture on the f7 square with the queen. The king goes on the d8 square, and now you can play a bishop to g5, not at this point, but you can also play a pawn to e6. Let's first see what you can do is the sneaky little move. You play a knight to d4. Idea behind knight d4 is attacking the queen as well as the c6 knight. If he captures your knight on the c6 square, then he is completely gone because it is a checkmate in 2 moves. Forcing checkmate. You can go with your bishop to g5. He plays his bishop e7, and then queen e7 is a checkmate. So remember that you have to play a knight to d4 over there. Alright. If he is not getting greedy and if he doesn't capture on the c2 square, instead he captures your queen. Then you recapture it with the knight, and you're happy to play this position ahead. This was the line when he is playing his knight to c6. Let's quickly have a look at one more line. What if after queen to f3, he is playing his pawn to f5, defending that knight, not capturing, not committing anything as of now. If he plays his pawn to f5 over here, you give an attack to the knight, play a pawn to d3. He's kind of forced to capture your knight. He captures on the c3 square, you recapture with your b pawn, and now when he plays his pawn to d4, this is something that you should know that this an advanced level player will know, or someone who knows the theory completely. You don't worry about the pawn on the c3 square. Let's sacrifice it and go for the normal development. You play you play a queen to g3, not allowing the bishop to come out. If he captures on the c3 square, you play a bishop to e2. Now, what's the idea behind bishop e2? The idea is to play bishop h5 check and finish the opponent. If he ignores your threat after bishop e2, if he plays a random looking move, like let's say he plays his pawn to a6, then you go with your bishop to h5, give a check. If he plays his pawn to g6, defending the check, then you capture back, queen check. The king comes up, bishop g5, winning the queen. And if the king goes on the d7 square, then you give this check. The king goes over here, then you can still play bishop g5. And if the king goes up over here, let's say he goes on the c6 square, then this is the check that you can give. A discovered attack and you win the queen. Here, if the king goes to d6, then again this discovered check. If he captures, then you are going to bishop g5 and you're going to win the queen. So any which ways, this Vienna Gambit will be very useful for you to play as white. We have covered almost all the variations, what white can do, what black can do, and how can you defend this. So my main idea behind recording all the variations over here is, what if you play with the beginners? Okay, what if you play with a beginner level player? He won't know the complete theory, but would try to do something or would want to surprise you soon in the opening. So you should know all the variations, all the lines, what are the possibilities, what can black play, and how you can win or take advantage in that particular variation too. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If so, then please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel and share with your chess friends. I'll see you again in the next video. Thank you.